article by Nisrain Turhan, reward and punishment, and the command and prohibition directed to the creature who owns the mind, and unless it is absent in man for what made him reward and punishment, and is of the type of bestiality, so the mind is the one that prevents man from falling into error and prevents him from committing sins, and then it is the fortress immune to him from destruction. In fact, these things are the result of the realization of the mind by reflection, and reflection. People with antisocial values may have a distorted sense of right and wrong, and may think that their own needs are more important than those of others. They may also have a lack of empathy, or the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. Hence the starting point, the dehumanization of this individual, which expresses the upbringing, formation, and damage to himself, his family, and society. This individual will turn into an easy seed in the hands of any terrorist group in order to plant him in any land they want and control him and his ideas as if he were a robot. And when asked why did you do this, his words will be, it includes the ability to justify criminal behavior and minimize possible consequences. People with criminal thinking may also be able to justify their behavior by blaming others or making excuses. People who are associated with criminals are more likely to engage in criminal behavior themselves. This is due to a number of factors, including peer pressure, opportunities to commit crimes, and normalization of criminal behavior. Lack of empathy. People with a lack of empathy may have difficulty understanding and paying attention to the feelings of others. This can make them more likely to engage in criminal behavior, as they may not be able to appreciate the harm they cause. Harsh non-emotional traits. Unemotional cruelty traits are characterized by a lack of guilt or remorse, lack of empathy, and a sense of absolute power. People with high levels of CU traits are more likely to engage in criminal behavior, especially violent crime. It is important to note that these are just some of the common signs of a criminal mindset. Not everyone who exhibits these traits will engage in criminal behavior. In addition, there are many other factors that can contribute to criminal behavior, such as poverty, mental illness, and the use of sedative drugs or drugs. Terrorism is criminal acts directed against the state whose purpose or nature is to spread terror among certain personalities or groups of persons, or from the general public. Terrorist acts are characterized by intimidation accompanied by violence, such as bombings, destruction of public facilities, destruction of railways, poisoning of drinking water, spreading infectious diseases, and mass murder. Extremism is deviating from the values, standards, and customs common in society, and adopting values and standards contrary to them. Resorting to the extremist party to impose its values and standards and impose its opinion by force is a form of terrorism, and more precisely, intellectual and religious extremism is one of the sources that lead to terrorism, especially since 95% of the cases of terrorism that swept the world during the past years were the result of extremism. There is no doubt that the danger of extremism increases when it moves from its intellectual, belief, and theoretical phase to the stage of practice and behavioral extremism that expresses itself in material forms using the means of violence, murder, and terrorism to achieve its goals. Extremism and terrorism have recently been associated with Islam, especially with the emergence of extremist religious groups such as ISIS and other organizations of all forms of religious and political extremism, whether in thought, belief, or behavior. Extremism has its roots due to several reasons, the most important of which are the following. Extremist ideologies. Terrorism relies on dehumanizing victims, and closed extremist ideologies that refuse to recognize the value and dignity of others are essential tools for mobilization and recruitment, and these ideologies fuel a culture of violence and intolerance, and increase support for terrorist groups. Lack of reliable religious references. Intolerant religious discourses based on misinterpretations and interpretations are paradoxical to the tolerance of Islam and contrary to the spirit of religions, which stems from the preservation of noble spiritual values that depend on love, compassion, tolerance, nonviolence, and acceptance of the other. The intellectual vacuum and the cessation of creativity and production, which fills the contemporary needs of human thought, the lack of interest in the affairs of culture and knowledge, the monitoring of intellectual currents that invaded Islamic countries, and the lack of development of jurisprudential and fundamental studies. The difficulty of economic life that most developing countries suffer from, as most of these countries suffer from economic and social problems that contribute to more frustration for all classes of society, especially the youth, which leads to their drift towards political and religious currents that exploit this frustration in order to achieve their goals, and then integrate these young people into the ranks of groups. The Global Terrorism Index 2018 confirmed that the victims of extremist and extremist organizations around the world reached 18,814 victims during 2017. More than half of the victims were killed by four terrorist groups: ISIS, the Taliban, the fundamentalist Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram, while the world suffered more than $52 billion in losses as a result of these terrorist operations. According to the 2018 Global Terrorism Index, overseen by the Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP, the four terrorist groups killed 10,632 people in 2017. 44% of terrorism victims have been killed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, and Syria in recent years. The following is the ranking of terrorist groups according to the index, published by Forbes. ISIS killed at least 4,350 people in 2017, and although the group has been largely crushed in Syria and Iraq, it is still capable of launching serious attacks in the Middle East, not to mention the presence of so-called lone wolves, people who pledged allegiance to the organization to carry out terrorist attacks in Europe and many countries of the world. ISIS has become inclined to the tactic of bombings and suicide attacks, which accounted for 69% of its attacks last year. However, it continues its policy of hostage-taking and assassination. Last year, it carried out 22% fewer attacks than the previous year, with the number of deaths dropping from 9,150 in 2016 to 4,350 in 2017. The number of deaths per attack also dropped from 8 in 2016 to 4.9 in 2017. Taliban. The extremist group in Afghanistan killed 3,571 people in 2017 and has been fighting a war of attrition against the US-backed international coalition since 2001. As of mid-2017, the Taliban were in full control of 11% of Afghanistan, fighting a guerrilla war over an estimated 29% of the country, and effectively operating within 70% of all Afghan provinces. In 2017, the Taliban were responsible for 699 terrorist attacks, killing 5,771 people, according to other statistics away from the Global Terrorism Index. Bombings were the most common form of attack. In addition, the Pakistani Taliban in the neighboring country is also responsible for 56 terrorist attacks and 233 deaths. According to the Global Index, Taliban attacks became more deadly last year, killing an average of 5.1 people per attack compared to an average of 4.2 people the previous year. The terrorist group has changed its tactics in recent years, shifting its focus away from attacks on civilian targets, and increasingly targeting police and military personnel. The Taliban killed 2,419 police and military personnel in 2017, up from 1,782 the previous year. The number of attacks on these targets also increased from 369 in 2016 to 386 in 2017, while the number of civilian deaths caused by the Taliban fell to 548 in 2017, compared to 1,223 in 2016. Al-Shabaab killing 1,457 people in 2017, The terrorist group emerged in 2006 to pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda, while Somalia is its main area of operations, but has also carried out terrorist attacks in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. Al-Shabaab was the deadliest group in sub-Saharan Africa in 2017, accounting for 1,457 deaths, an increase of 93% from the previous year, and two-thirds of the deaths were in the Somali capital Mogadishu. Al-Shabaab's worst incident was in October last year, when 588 people were killed and 316 injured in an explosion outside a safari hotel in Mogadishu's Hadan district. While many of the countries hardest hit by terrorism have seen a drop in deaths in recent years, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, and Pakistan, Somalia was an unfortunate exception due to Al-Shabaab attacks, with more than 6,000 people killed by terrorism since 2001. Boko Haram. It killed 1,254 people in 2017, and that group was founded in Nigeria and was also known as the Great Sinna Group, and there came a time when it was considered the largest terrorist group in the world, but it began to decline since 2014, and it recently suffered cases of defection to emerge from many factions, perhaps the most prominent of which is what has become known as the organization, ISIS, in West Africa. Since Boko Haram's emergence in northeastern Nigeria in 2002, splinter factions have spread to other neighboring countries including Chad, Cameroon, and Niger, to pledge allegiance to ISIS. The figures indicate that the number of victims of terrorism in Nigeria has decreased in recent years, with the number of victims falling by 83% in 2017 compared to 2014, underscoring the significant role played by security forces in that African region, with the help of international allies. Boko Haram carried out 40% of the attacks and was responsible for only 15% of the number of terror victims in 2017, compared to the previous year. Most Boko Haram attacks were carried out in Nigeria, particularly in Borno State, as well as fewer in Cameroon and Niger. The group has gained notoriety for mass hostage takings, and the massive exploitation of women and children to carry out suicide attacks. Other terrorist groups. In addition to the 4 dangerous terrorist organizations, there are hundreds of extremist groups scattered around the world, most of them small groups, with the exception of Al-Qaeda, which is believed to have 30,000 fighters in 17 countries in the Middle East and Africa. There are other lesser-known groups, but they have begun to emerge in the recent period, including the Fulani group in Nigeria, which was responsible for 321 deaths and 72 attacks in 2017, and here the Institute for Peace and World Economy confirms that there has been a significant increase in violence and terrorism in this group, which was evident this year. In Syria, there are several terrorist groups, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as Jabhat Fateh al-Sham and al-Nusra, and Jaish al-Islam, both of which were responsible for 176 and 127 killings, respectively in 2007. In Pakistan, many terrorist groups such as Lashkar-Jangvi and the Khorasan faction of the Islamic State group are active, which is also active across the border in Afghanistan, and in neighboring India. The deadliest group last year was the Communist Party of India, Maoist, which killed 205 people and carried out more than 190 attacks. The northern Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir is a special focus of terrorist activity in India, and last year, there were 5 militant groups active on the ground, including Lashkar-Taiba and Hizbul al-Mujahideen, and these groups killed more than 102 people. In Yemen, the most active terrorist group is the Houthi militias fighting the legitimate government, and there is what has come to be known as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and ISIS's Aden Abayan organization. The New People's Army in the Philippines is one of the most terrorist groups in Asia, killing 113 people last year in 235 attacks across the country. In the Philippines, there is also the Abu Sayyaf group, which pledged allegiance to the terrorist organization ISIS, and was responsible in 2017 for the deaths of 37 people. And there is also a fundamentalist group called Maute, which killed 26 people. In Yemen, the most active terrorist group is the Houthi militias fighting the legitimate government, and there is what has come to be known as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and ISIS's Aden Abayan organization. The New People's Army in the Philippines is one of the most terrorist groups in Asia, killing 113 people last year in 235 attacks across the country. In the Philippines, there is also the Abu Sayyaf group, which pledged allegiance to the terrorist organization ISIS, and was responsible in 2017 for the deaths of 37 people. And there is also a fundamentalist group called Maute, which killed 26 people. In Western Europe and North America, right-wing extremists pose a growing. In 2017, these racist groups carried out 59 terrorist attacks that killed 17 people. And those attacks were motivated by racist white supremacy, and hostile to religious and ethnic minorities. Islam is a religion of love and moderation is the only project in the face of all these perverted ways that exploit true. Moderate Islam is neither an individual nor a collective project, but rather a project of an entire nation, its Arabs, an approach that binds its unity and is documented by its court of affairs. This important demand has become a long-term goal for some Arab and Islamic countries, because they have felt and been affected by the practices of some Islamic currents that are leaning towards the extreme right, as it is. The danger in this lies in the fact that right-wing people from ideological currents aim to have safe homelands under the umbrella of future projects, homelands that advance the entire nation and not a homeland in it. With the obsolescence of time and the height of its dust on the purity of this tolerant religion, the time has come to reconsider many of the concepts and terms prevailed in the name of Islam in previous ages, so that some enthusiasts of extremism come to revive them together in this time that does not resemble its recent past, as well as its distant. The first leader of humanity to manage the diaries of this Islam and its moderation is the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the master of the first two and the seal of the two prophets according to the consensus of the people of religion of all sects and sects, even those who lost their way with the succession of. If we read the biography of the Prophet in all impartiality and distance from the lofty as well as unbridled interpretations, we find that he was an individual in this nation, and he did not feel far and wide that he was the illiterate prophet and God's mercy to the worlds of his people, his paradise, his tree, and his madras. A Jew's funeral passes by him while he is sitting, and he rises for it, and some object, and they are not any other, but the one who saved the companions, and the peace and blessings of God respond to him. Is it not a breathed soul? The Prophet has been put more than once to the test among the Jews, once when he pawned his armor with them, and another time when he visited a patient for them. Each time he rose to them and some entered his religion voluntarily without coercion, except for those who preferred his Quranic creation and his divine biography. My examples began with the Jews because there is great confusion in the political arena, and the excessive sensitivity in dealing with the Jews like the rest of the peoples of the earth, and with Israel as an occupying state for Palestine, the beating heart of the world, not just Muslims. When the two things are disengaged, we know how to walk the path of moderate Islam with the Jews, like all other nations, without overwhelming racism, crushing hatred, or hateful discrimination. This moderate Islam and its rulings, orientations, guidelines, and ethics ruled the whole world at that time in a record period that did not exceed a quarter of a century of time. After the Four Ages, the era of King Al-Adhd came with Muawiyah's assumption of the caliphate, and in fact he inaugurated the first monarchy in Islamic history. It is Muawiyah, the writer of Revelation, who faced the beginnings of individual Islamic militancy with the great companion Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, who was very critical of him until he exiled him to Rabza, in which the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, said what it means. You will die alone, be buried alone, and be cornered alone. As for the public affairs, the Jews were the most praised people from Muawiyah, and they were the ones who said about him, "May Allah have mercy on Abu Yazid, for he used to treat us with his hair, and if he tightened our looseness, and if we loosened, he tightened us." Is there more moderation with both sides of the Islamic equation, whether with Abu Dhar, may Allah have mercy on him, or with the Jews who were part of the Islamic community? As for the Christians, it is no secret to anyone how the king of Abyssinia at the time had contained Islam and protected it from his enemies, who are from the people of the Prophet and not strangers. Even if the term came and the Prophet came to the news, the Prophet prayed the prayer of the absent after he learned of his Islam secretly. And may you find the closest among them affection, for those who have believed, those who said we are Christians. They now protect Islam from the Muslims themselves according to the universal laws of moderation, which are inseparable from the absolute justice of Islam and which accommodate all people, and Muslims themselves are only one part of the rest of the races.